This talk is on the fourth way and Gurdjieff's theories of centers and eyes. Know thyself. These words are usually attributed to Socrates, but they go back much further. The truth remains, whatever the case, that self-knowledge is the beginning of all wisdom. If you do not know yourself, and thus how it is you, whatever that may be, approach the world, how can you hope to understand the world, and thus reality itself? According to the work, the fourth way, the teachings of Gurdjieff, we are far different than we imagine ourselves to be, and oneself is a subject which almost everyone is extremely ignorant. There may very well not be such a thing as one's self. We attribute to ourselves all sorts of qualities, such as inner unity, control, and will, which we did not in fact possess, says Kenneth Walker. To know thyself is to begin from the position that we do not know ourselves, and any investigation into thyself which is apparent is built upon a false foundation. Before beginning to know thyself, one therefore must admit they may very well not know themselves at all. As we saw in my first talk, man is a machine. Man is also asleep. And when we think back to the story of the man who takes a simple walk to the store, we realize he has no will. He has no control over himself. He has no control over reality. He is simply a machine. But what conclusion is to be drawn from this? Uspensky makes it clear, where the traditional understanding of know thyself goes wrong, is that it begins from psychology. And yet, psychology as we understand it refers to men, to humans, to the psyche. What's the problem there? We are dealing with machines. And so what we need is mechanics, not psychology. Machines don't have a psychology. We need to study mechanics in order to be able to understand the machine. So to begin to know ourselves, to know thyself, we need to begin with mechanics. Let us look now at Gurdjieff's theory regarding man's mind in detail. For Gurdjieff, and thus for the work, man does not have a single unified mind, but in fact has 7 different kinds of minds. 7. More commonly called centers within the language of the work, each of which has the potential to make a contribution to the sum total of man's knowledge. Let me go through these. The first mind is the intellectual mind, or the intellectual center, occupied with, as one would imagine, constructing theories, comparison, logic, and reasoning. I draw your attention to the figure on the slide of the centers. The second center, or the second mind, though I prefer to use the term center, is the emotional center, concerning itself, as one would imagine, with feelings over ideas, feelings and emotions. The third mind is the physical mind, or physical center, or the moving center, and it is one which controls movements and physicality. Next we have the fourth mind, which is called the instinctive center, which controls physiological functions such as digestion and respiration. And where the third and the fourth mind differ is that the fourth controls these instinctive things that we do without any means of attentive control to them, such as digestion, breathing, respiration, etc. Whereas the third mind, the moving center, is in terms of our control and attentiveness of our movements which we are able to control and be attentive of. These first 4 minds or centers are considered the lower centers. The first 3, the intellectual, the emotional, and the moving center, are of primary importance in the work and are called the 3 chief centers. In addition to all of these centers, these 4, there is also man's sex center and 2 higher varieties of the lower centers, the higher intellectual center and the higher emotional center. These higher centers are only active in fully developed people. So when we think back to the first talk on levels of consciousness, these two centers are only active in those of a higher level of consciousness, those who are awake. But as is made clear with respect to levels of consciousness, occasionally one has flashes of that which is above, and the same applies to these centers. One may have a flash of the higher emotional center or a flash of the higher intellectual center. At the beginning of the work, as I have stated, the primary focus is on the first three centers, which are considered the three chief centers: the lower intellectual, the lower emotional, and the lower moving center. For these are what we have access to in our waking sleep, in our level of common machinic consciousness. We have access to them, we can observe them, and eventually, possibly, to a degree, hopefully, control them, understand them, be attentive of them. Ouspensky describes these centers as a three-storied building. At the top, we have the intellectual center, in the middle was the emotional center, and at the bottom is the moving and instinctive centers. Though all these centers are widespread throughout the entire body, the intellectual center is concentrated, as one would imagine, in the head, the emotional center in the solar plexus, and the moving center in the spinal cord, and the instinctive center at the base of the abdomen. If one struggles to think of these as minds, as many who have been conditioned by Cartesian philosophy will, in the sense that there's somehow these four different brains or something of the sort floating around us, if you struggle with this, one can think of these centers as simply four functions which work throughout the body: thinking, feeling, moving, and regulating. In addition to these primary four, there is the sexual function, the higher intellectual, and higher emotional functions, though these are unable to manifest themselves, at least from this state of waking sleep consciousness. Gurdjieff would then go on to state that we can classify all creatures on Earth in relation to these centers, classifying them in relation to the amount of centers they have, with some animals being simply regulatory or purely Darwinian, such as microbes. They have no emotions, they have no intellect, and they don't really have control of their movements. They are simply this regulatory body, but they are a certain level of consciousness to a degree. They are a living thing, and so they are of that level. Some are simply moving and regulatory, such as perhaps worms, but they don't have emotions or intellect. Some with moving and emotional centers, and the lesser centers below that, such as dogs and cats. And finally, man, the only animal, according to Gurdjieff, with the intellectual center, the man who has all four of these lower centers. The relative activity of the three chief centers, intellectual, emotional, and moving, also allowed Gurdjieff to classify men into 3 or 4 headings. We have man number 1. He is merely a man who imitates. He who merely imitated everyone around himself in every way possible, thoughts, feelings, and movements. These men are controlled by their moving center. Man number 2, a man who is primarily controlled by his emotional center, seeking in life only what is pleasurable and avoiding what is unpleasurable, often mutating basic emotions into pathological events. Man number 2 abides by the emotional center. Man number 3, he who is swayed by theories, reason, and logic. He who takes everything literally. Everything can be worked out and reasoned for this man. A man primarily of the intellectual center. We have men 1, 2, and 3. Now, one might be mistaken in thinking that the man who is intellectual is somehow superior to the emotional, or the man who is emotional is somehow superior to the intellectual. Or even those who have a emphasis in their lives on sports and physicality, they may believe that man number 1 is superior to the other 2. None of these men are superior to one another. Men 1, 2, and 3 are all of the same level, for they are all at the mercy of a single psychological, that is to say, mechanical center. They are at the mercy of a single emphasis of all possibilities. They lean. This method of classification allows one to observe, both in others and in themselves, the lopsided nature of man's development. The aim with regard to self-development in the work is that no center should be an island, and that they should work harmoniously are like an orchestra. This is where man number 4 comes in. He is a man whose centers no longer overtake the work of another. He has a permanent center of gravity, the result of effort of a definite characteristic. He already knows himself and whither he goes, states Uspensky. Unfortunately for us, this is rarely how our centers work. We rarely have this orchestral equilibrium and harmony of our centers, where each one is doing its own job and not intruding into the work of another. A point in our lives where the intellectual center does its own work and the emotional center does its own work and the moving center does its own work. We're not emotionally making intellectual decisions, and then we're not intellectually making emotional decisions. Often the emotional center takes over the intellectual, making a decision which is informed by a feeling as opposed to a fact, to empirical data. But equally there are times when our analysis should yield to feeling. And equally there are times when both should allow the moving center to take over. Such discordance between centers resembled a type of orchestra, namely one which lacks a conductor, with each member doing only what it deemed to be right, and not thinking of the equilibrium of the whole. The emotional center thinks it's doing what it thinks is right. The intellectual center is doing the same, and likewise with the moving. Thoughts without regards for feelings, feelings without regard for thoughts, and movements made callously without thought or emotion. A machine asleep, clambering haphazardly through life. Gurdjieff and Uspensky, and the beginning of one's journey, place emphasis on the 3 chief centers in terms of, once again, observation. We should observe ourselves in terms of these centers. Was a decision or action primarily an effort of the intellectual, emotional, or moving center? Are we lopsided? Am I lopsided? Are we conflating thoughts and feelings? Are thoughts intruding into feelings and feelings intruding into thoughts? Are the works of different centers intruding into the works of other centers? And yet, once again, this is not an observation of psychology. We're not seeking to develop or change when we observe. For once we tamper with an observation, it ceases to be an observation. You cannot analyze an observation, because once you do, it becomes analysis and not observation. To observe is to leave it be. Simply to observe. Doing so and analyzing an observation enters it into the realm of introspection, and that is not what one should be doing. One's task should be only to observe, as one would observe the outputs and functions of a machine. Now there's a brief note here. The 3 chief centers, intellectual, emotional, and moving, are in accordance with what Gurdjieff saw as the 3 traditional paths to enlightenment. The way of the fakir, self-mastery of the body. The way of the monk, self-mastery of the emotions. And the way of the yogi, self-mastery of mental habits and capabilities, knowledge. The goal, as Gurdjieff saw it, was to produce a well-balanced and sane human being. Therefore, he concludes that mastering one of these ways would lead only to an unbalanced self, an unbalanced man. Hence why Gurdjieff's work is named the 4th way, because we have ways 1, 2, and 3, and the 4th way combines all of these and all centers into a single path which has harmony between them all. Back to observation. Why observe? Firstly, observation allows one to see themselves as the machine they are, to notice the habitual existence they abide by every day. But what of these observations once collected? Man, according to Uspensky, is not only a machine, but a machine which works very much below the standard it would be capable of maintaining if it were working properly. It is necessary for us, therefore, to observe ourselves very closely, not only in order to obtain knowledge of our mechanism, but also in order that we may realize how much better our machinery might be made to work. There are many defects which are common to us all as ordinary human beings, and there are also forms of bad working which are peculiar to ourselves individually. In this preliminary stage of self-study, it is necessary that we should become thoroughly familiar with our own particular failings. Walker gives an example of this way of thinking of ourselves as having multiple centers. When one learns to ride a bike, at first it must be a duet between the moving and the intellectual center. You must hold the bike correctly, you must think about where you place your body weight, think about where you place your feet, and think about where you must apply pressure to the bike. You must think about what it is you need to do, but at the same time, use that intellectual center to coordinate the movements. At the beginning, if one's attention strays for a moment, one will tumble from the bike. Then slowly but surely, one gets the hang of it. And then, all of a sudden, there's no need for the intellectual center anymore. The moving center takes over completely. And after this has happened, one will find, much like learning to drive a car, or learning many, many skills, that something has become so habitual to a certain center, in the case of riding a bike, the moving center, that attempting to take over the action with another center, thinking about how to ride a bike, thinking about how to drive a car, for instance, actually hampers the efforts now and makes the act more difficult. Because the center who's found its work has taken on its work and it no longer needs the other centers to do so. It has its work. Where may this lead? This observation of these different centers. Back to Uspensky. Perhaps the earliest and most disquieting of the findings made in this way was that I was never the same for more than a few minutes. And yet I had the effrontery to preface many of my remarks with such misleading phrases as, "I always think that," or "I am convinced that," or "I feel strongly that." What nonsense! I realize now that frequently I had thought and felt quite differently from the way in which I was thinking and feeling in that particular moment. And who was it that was making this dogmatic thought about his own thoughts and his feelings? Who, in short, was I, in quotation marks? That is from Kenneth Walker in his book, A Study of Gurdjieff's Teaching. From observation of our centers, then, we realize that we are several I's. We say this word, as Walker makes clear, every day, constantly. We say it with an affirmation of complete certainty. I feel that. I am going to do this. I am going to bed. I'm going on a diet. I'm going to wake up. I'm going to eat a very fatty meal. I am going to do 1,000 different things, all supposedly the same I. But when we begin to observe ourselves, observe our centers, and think about these centers, we realize we're not one I. We are several I's. We are quite literally many I's. We come up against this word I just so often that we don't think about it. I'm sitting, I'm writing, I'm doing. I'm unhappy, I'm happy. I'm content, I'm uncontent. And herein is the vital mistake machines make of themselves. They think that they are one. They think that they have unity. That they are in any sense unified. At one moment, one part or center of me speaks. The emotional center, the intellectual center, the moving center. At another moment, a different part of me speaks, a different center, and so on and so on. We have a multitude of I's connected with all our different centers, each of which seeks to pronounce itself as the controller for the momentary instance. We define it as ourselves. But who is that ourself? Who is the I which defines the moment when I am speaking? Who is it that says I am going on a diet? And who is it that says I am going to eat a cream bun the very next day? Who is it that says I am going to get up early the night before? But who is it who says in the morning I will snooze the alarm and sleep in until midday? These cannot be the same person, and in fact they are not. And yet, what is it to think of them as the same person? It is madness. It is insanity. It is a false unification of a multitude of hypocrisies. How can all these I's coexist within a single unification? It is complete nonsense. But it is what the machine believes. It is what the man who is asleep believes. That he is unified, that he is one I, that there is some masterful, singular I which does all these things. This is complete rubbish. We have all these eyes connected to all our different centers, all at different times and all at different intensities, and making all these different decisions. And we must begin to notice, to observe the many different eyes in us. I go to bed James, I wake up Paul. I make a decision as Peter, and I attempt to undertake it as Matthew. I proclaim X as John, and I argue for Y as Mark. And what if man accepts himself as one? What if we do what machines do, and we accept and believe and trust in this absolute falsity, which is the unity of ourselves? There can be no struggle. There can be no suffering. There can be no struggling. There can be no effort. Unless man can divide himself, he can't change. There cannot be within a man of false unity, of a belief of unity, that which commands and that which obeys. To have that which commands and that which obeys, and therefore to develop oneself and to progress, you need to be able to divide yourself. You need to be able to notice the different eyes. There cannot be observed the eyes which are to the detriment of a man unless he's able to divide himself. A man goes to bed motivated to start dieting, to lose weight. Upon waking, he no longer wishes to, and proceeds to eat an unhealthy breakfast. If this man takes himself as one, nothing can change. There's no division. There's no difference. No good or bad. Both these hypocrisies somehow exist within the same place. Both these eyes are apparently the same person. Both these centers are all merged in this horrible chimera, which makes of absolutely no sense. But in division, we see that we are multiple eyes, with multiple centers making multiple decisions, with emphases on all these different centers. And we can begin to just observe these eyes. We can begin to observe them and begin a process of self-development. We need to form then an I which observes. For if man is one, how can he seek to observe himself? How can you observe yourself if you are only a singular? How can you get outside of yourself and observe yourself if you are a complete unity? If you can't divide yourself and you are observing yourself, where are you observing yourself from? You are observing yourself from the I which supposedly observes. How can a single self observe itself? It is an impossibility. A self which imagines itself as a unity has nothing to observe. It is what it is. All its decisions are what it is. Whereas he who can observe the divisions, the discrepancies, the hypocrisies, the paradoxes of his very being, he can begin the process of self-observation, of observing. See you all in the next talk. If you're interested in these ideas sincerely, please find details in the description below. Thank you.